I'm just going to ask you to share a little bit about your trajectory in organizing social change, politics, just kind of situate yourself a little bit for us.
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. And I love all the work of all of your organizations and have some relationship to most of them. So it's really cool to spend some time with you. And Deepak, thank you for the invitation. All right. So just a little bit about me. So I'm from New York. I was born and raised on the South Shore of Long Island, late 70s. All right. Oh, got a Long Island person. Cool. The tail end of the 70s. Both of my parents are immigrants from the Caribbean, Trinidad and Grenada. And my family came to this country following my grandmother, who came here in the late 60s as a domestic worker. She worked primarily in the homes of upper middle class white folks in Long Island. And, when she first came here, she didn't have a home. She was a residential domestic worker from Monday through Friday. And then on the weekends, literally was homeless and would spend some time in parks on the weekends. And I remember this story very well. This woman who was a church leader just saw my grandmother in the park and asked her, like, what are you doing? And she's like, I'm off. And eventually, through that church leader, she was able to stay with that church leader for a while. And then eventually she got an apartment. Eventually she was able to, by hook or by crook, both under and over the border, get all of her kids to the US. So I grew up in this context of this extended family that included a lot of cousins, a lot of aunties and uncles, all living in Long Beach. So like most of the Caribbean population in Long Beach is as a direct result of my grandmother, because actually after she brought her 10 children and their spouses and all of their children, she became this way station for folks from anywhere in the Caribbean to come to Long Island and New York, and was kind of like a job clearinghouse and helped other people do what she did. Folks from Guyana, from Jamaica, from Trinidad. So I tell that story because, and also I think it's important that to contextualize the fact that, like, I grew up, I was born in 79, but I grew up mainly in the 80s during the crack era. And my mom was a nurse in Far Rockaway, right across the bridge from Long Beach. She worked as a detox nurse during the crack era. And so all of those things really influenced my understanding of the world. The other thing I would say is that growing up as a Grenadian and being 4 when the United States invaded my father's home country also had a significant impact on my politicization very early. And Grenada was a socialist Black republic. Very early on, witnessing the differences and the contradictions and the challenges, race, class, gender, immigration status, the global South versus the global North, going back and forth from the Caribbean to the US. All those things had a huge impact on my understandings, and it had a huge early impact on what I wanted to do in the world. So very early on, I knew I wanted to be involved in social change. My parents came from countries that were colonies that became independent countries, and they were raised they grew up in the 60s and met each other in England at a time when things were very political. And so I was politicized by them. Like, I had access to Marx, I had access to Mao, I had access to Calypso and soca and reggae. I had access to all these things very early on. And so I decided I wanted to walk in the footsteps of people like Kwame Ture, people like Marcus Garvey, people like Malcolm X, the people that my parents would elevate as being heroes. And I started organizing as a young person in middle school. I started finding opportunities to get involved in insurgent elections in Long Beach city council elections. And as a middle school student, I petitioned for this thing called the New Party, which eventually became the Working Families Party in the mid-90s. I eventually went to Howard University, which was the college home of Stokely Carmichael, who is a Trinidadian immigrant and Black freedom fighter. And I was a campus organizer at Howard University, where I really feel like I started organizing in earnest and did my first direct actions around police violence. And then eventually I went back home because I felt very clear that you go back home to organize, you organize your people. So I went back home to Long Island and I spent almost a decade in an under-resourced, pretty small grassroots organization called the Long Island Progressive Coalition, which is part of like the Citizen Action Network. And at the time, I was the only organizer. It was just me and the ED. And I mean, man, like the best education you could possibly get is working in an under-resourced organization where, you know, I did not have the requisite experience, but I was just told I had to do everything. And you either you sink or swim. It's like not the best pedagogy, but like you figure it out. And for those 9 years, that you know, knocking on tons of doors, building campaigns, both winning campaigns and losing campaigns, like issue campaigns, working on electoral campaigns, building the power of the organization from the ground up, was a wonderful experience and one that I would always cherish. I began to do regional work. Eventually, I worked for Citizen Action of New York as the organizing director there. I was the first director of the New York Civic Engagement Table, which is a collaborative of C3 organizations and C4 organizations that work on civic engagement, electoral strategy. And I also concurrently was involved in a lot of other work in the movement, critical resistance, which, you know, really laid the groundwork and the intellectual sort of framework for prison abolition. I was involved in that. I was involved in Malcolm X Grassroots and the People's Self-Defense Campaign, or the Cop Watch campaign, where we would literally be patrolling the police, and involved in a lot of like extracurricular work, movement work outside, especially Black movement work outside of my paid gig. And you know, when Trayvon was killed, I was one of the organizers in New York City that organized mass mobilizations around the acquittal of Zimmerman. And then when Michael Brown was murdered, and it was really in response to feeling that the work that happened following Trayvon was so hollow because his family did not get justice, I decided to kind of really lean in. And so what that looked like was me reaching out to the Organization for Black Struggle in St. Louis and embedding with them while the fires of Ferguson were still hot, and leaving my job and my family and my friends, and helping to birth the movement for Black Lives and catalyze it to become an international movement. And when Trump got elected, I felt a calling again to try to create a multiracial electoral alignment to defeat Donald Trump and defeat the white nationalist wave that he rode to the White House. And I became, in 2018, August 2018, I became the national director of the Working Families Party, where I am today. Now that Trump is no longer there, still working on what I think will be like a generational challenge of defeating all of the underlying conditions that created Trump and Trumpism, and winning the cultural and political war that we're in against the forces of white supremacy and the anti-democratic and pro-corporate forces that are continuing to gain after, you know, people thought that the defeat of Trump, some people thought the defeat of Trump would somehow be a defeat of those forces, but they're very resilient. So there's still a lot of work to be done.
That was amazing. Thank you for sharing that, Maurice. It's a very inspiring trajectory and present. And so I think a lot of folks in the class are actually familiar at some level with the Working Families Party, but I've been really inspired by the reboot that you've done. And I wonder if you could just speak to like what the analysis was underneath the reboot, what it was, what this Working Families Party strategy is now in this current period.
Sure. Okay, great. So I think our analysis was that um, the Democratic Party, as it is, with all of its structures in place, is insufficient to achieve the outcomes that all of everybody's organization, if it's a labor organization, if it's a grassroots organization, is committed to. It's just insufficient. And the reason why it's insufficient is that, like, the Republican Party is wholly corporately captured, and the Democratic Party is mainly or partially corporately captured. And both of these parties, in a country where there's like more than 300 million people, and the country is the size of a continent, these two parties don't necessarily operate like political parties. They almost more operate like two marketing schemes in order to create an electoral coalition that would get to 50% plus one. And the Republicans, since the late 60s, has relied on white Christian identity, white identity, and then eventually white Christian identity, and has aligned with certain columns of capital in order to fund what is just a very expensive multi-billion-dollar effort to keep that coalition together. And the Democratic Party has done the same, but its coalition looks different. It is a multiracial coalition, but the Democratic, in order to fund their multi-billion-dollar effort, they also access columns of capital. And Wall Street, for example, gives almost equally to Democrats and Republicans, right? And one of the ways that Democrats try to split the baby is they offer social rights concessions to different parts of its base, right? But what they try to do is somehow disaggregate the social rights concessions from the economic rights concessions. And generally, they act as a moderating force against the economic rights desires of the grassroots of their base, while providing the social rights concessions. And that's a good deal for Wall Street, right? So the reason why Wall Street pays for the Democrats is to moderate the desires of the grassroots of the Democratic Party. The reason they pay for the Republicans is because they want to live in the most limited government regime possible, right? But they're paying for something with both parties, right? And neither of those things are what we actually want as working people. And we believe working people deserve a political party. And in this particular historical juncture, we think it's more important than ever that that political party is explicit about race and racial justice, could talk about race and class at the same time, and could be a coming together of labor institutions, grassroots organizations, social movements, and the activists that have really taken off over the past. The activism's taken off over the past like decades from Occupy. And so this version of the Working Families Party, the reboot, it seeks to do two things. It seeks to broaden the coalition, because the Working Families Party coalition has always been labor and community, but broaden the coalition so there are four legs of the stool: labor, community, social movements, which are different types of actors than labor community groups, and the activists who are freely, sort of like free actors who need a political home, who wave after wave after wave are emerging. So there's that piece, the coalition piece. The other piece is the other sort of reboot. I would say like there's three reboot sort of emphases. The second one is taking seriously our organizational form as a political party, and specifically as a hybrid party. So by hybrid party, our members are both institutions and individuals, so that we have a rank and file individual membership, as well as institutions like, for example, Make the Road in New York is an institutional member of the New York Party, right? And then the third piece, and this is something that we're now, I feel like, after 3 years of like rearranging things, able to take seriously, is focusing like a laser on, yes, we have a left politic, but the way that you demonstrate the impact of your left politic is not by saying left words, but by organizing working people, right? And so the third piece is taking seriously and making investment in building out the organizing of the multiracial working class over time to build into a durable working class electoral united front. And so over the next 5 years, the way that we plan on testing that out is by investing a lot of resources in building a working class cadre everywhere where we operate. And then hope the idea is that from that cadre would spring mass, right? And so that's kind of where we're at right now. And those are I think the shifts that we've made. We're trying to build on our past history and our coalition, what works about that coalition form, and then put on top of it these other pieces. And then the other thing I would say is like, leadership matters. And I think we've chosen to really lean into areas that I think the analysis in the late 90s was like, you don't lean into contentious issues if you're trying to build the multiracial coalition. And we're doing the opposite. We're leaning into those things and trying to build a multiracial coalition. So we're having open conversations about race instead of being more silent about race, in a hope that we could bring those forces together.
So to zoom out a little bit from the very impressive work of the Working Families Party to look at the kind of larger landscape, love to hear you reflect a little bit on your analysis of where we are right now. So what do we face? Like, what is facing us from the right? What's your assessment broadly of left forces? If there is a common strategic task for all of us, which hopefully there is, like what is that? Like what does the moment demand for us, whether it's, the next 5 years or 10 years or however you think this will play out. So kind of, 30,000 foot view of the balance of forces and what the strategy is and should be for us.
Sure. So 40,000 foot. So, we're at it, like almost exactly 40 years of the neoliberal era, right? Like if you put it at, like 79, the year I was born. And being at the tail end of those 40 years, I feel like we're in this interesting moment where there's this, and I think it has a lot to do with, like capitalism, it has like a cyclical sort of design element where it experiences cyclical crisis, right? And so, one of the things I always like to say is that we shouldn't be surprised that we're experiencing crisis. It's just, we should assume under capitalism that we will experience crises. It's just like the form the crisis takes, the intensity, those are the things that we're often like, oh, wow, and I feel like in this particular moment, it's not a coincidence that we're faced with intense climate calamity, right? And at the same time, a global pandemic. And then and this is not just we in the United States, everybody around the world is experiencing this. It's like all billions of us. And at the same time, the secondary impacts of the global pandemic, the secondary psychological and economic impacts of that global pandemic. And at the same time, globally, and this is true in South America, this is true in North America, this is true in Europe, this is true in places in Africa, not everywhere, we're witnessing the politicization of nationalism and national identity. The alliance of nationalist, it's happening in India, it's happening, the alliance of nationalist forces and the far right. And it takes the form in countries that are white majority, the alliance of white nationalist forces and the far right. as well as like right-wing right-wing theocratic forces, right? So like in the US, it's the white Christian identity movement. In India, it's the Hindu nationalist and the right-wing government there. You know, it takes different forms in different countries, but there's a through line that's taking place. And so that's my overall analysis. It's like all of those forces are at play, and there's a crisis of legitimacy that's happening with working people everywhere, right? And that crisis of legitimacy creates an opening, but it isn't necessarily like a left opening, right? So it creates an opening, and the crisis of legitimacy could lead to a rupture, but it isn't necessarily a rupture from capitalism, right? That rupture simply creates a vacuum that will be filled. And the question for all of us is, who will fill that vacuum? Which forces will fill that vacuum? And generally, the most organized forces in society fill the vacuum, not the most ethical or the most right? So it doesn't matter as an organizer how right you think you are, how righteous you are. What matters is how organized and how powerful you are. That's the only thing that matters. And what's not true is that the good guys always win. What's actually true historically is the people with the most power always win. That is the history of capitalism, slavery, imperialism for the past 500 years. And we shouldn't be Pollyanna-ish about it. What we should do is build power, soberly build enough power in order to defeat the forces that seek to constrain the power of people. And we have an opportunity in those ruptures to do so, because in those ruptures, when the prevailing forces are trying to reorganize themselves, there's disarray. There's disarray with different columns of capital. There's disarray with different members of the ruling class, and that creates openings for us. There's a term in warfare, asymmetrical warfare, right? We will never have as much access to capital as organized capital, but we shouldn't seek that. We should land on and sort of leverage our unique superpowers. We could be more nimble. We could be more creative. We could use people power. We could use the power of culture. We could use, the power of story. And where we see these opportunities, we could practice experiments. And I think that is, if we choose, an opportunity for all of us. And it requires a level of soberness and a level of humility to accept that if we are to win, it's going to require us to do things that we haven't done before in ways that we haven't done. And we always have to assess the time, place, and conditions. And as strategists, we both need to carry our hearts into the battle and then be able to operate from a place of clinical and scientific discipline as to in order to assess the actual amount of power we have and the amount of power that our enemies have, so that we don't lead our forces into an onslaught, right? And that takes a certain set of capacities that require a lot of discipline in order to develop, right? I think that's what is called on us as leaders, not to simply believe the things that we tell ourselves in our head, but to actually assess the material conditions and then develop strategy based on that.
Thank you for that. That was really provocative. And I sort of want to follow up on that question, your take on the big picture view of what's happening, with maybe a couple of how you see the implications of that for two issues. One is kind of what's the relationship between left forces and liberals and moderates in this period, given the threat that you outlined for us in the US and abroad. And then also the perennial race class debate is in full flower again after the 2021 electoral results. And I'm curious how what sense do you make of that debate and of the results, and kind of what, you partly answered this in terms of how you reposition Working Families Party, I think, but kind of play that out a little bit more.
Great. So, okay. When I think about the left, right, I think about a series of forces that are loosely aligned, but not deeply aligned, right? Like I would say that if you want to see alignment, look at the centrist in the Democratic Party. They're very aligned, right? Very disciplined. One of the things, one of the ways that you could tell that they're disciplined is that they're able to, come election time, they're able to consolidate the centrist field when they need to. They just do it, right? We have trouble doing that. When it's clear as day, for example, like with an election, that there's too many people, too many progressives running in a race, there is no mechanism that easily consolidates that field. We just kind of watch it happening and what happened in slow motion, and watch how the vote of progressives, if you were to add them all up, would be a majority of the vote, ends up splitting the vote, and just watching the glide path of a centrist just take opposite. So that is a function, that is a live test of the ability of a particular faction to exhibit discipline on itself. And the centrists have it. They did it in the presidential election. Buttigieg got a phone call. He's like, all right, I'm out of this thing, right? The other thing I would say is that I think both the size of the actual, a left in this country is both impressive and simply insufficient, right? Like, it's impressive that around a quarter of the Democratic Party electorate will vote for a leftist. I think it's impressive, actually, that in some places, like with Buffalo, India Walton defeated out and out the 16-year incumbent. What we didn't imagine is that the 16-year incumbent will align with the far right and the right, and engage in a sore loser campaign that was funded by organized capital, and end up unfortunately defeating her. But I say that to say that what the left currently has in the United States is meaningful. The fact that a democratic socialist could get millions of votes in the context of the United States is miraculous. It's insufficient electorally to win electoral majorities. But what's also true is that our issues are majoritarian. So even as our candidates lag, and some of our candidates could win Democratic primaries in certain big cities, mainly coastal cities, our issues are majoritarian. If you look at Build Back Better, and it's hard to even think about this, but if you look at Obama's platform and just A/B it with the Build Back Better, it's miraculous. It's miraculously farther to the left, more than we would ever even acknowledge, because Joe Biden's doing it. So he's not a leftist, so he's not progressive. So the stuff that he does, it's hard to even look at like that. But Obama, that wasn't that long ago. And I mean, almost by any measure, Joe Biden's policy agenda is not just a few degrees further, it is significantly further. And to me, that is an example of the impact of the left in this country, and the impact of our social movements, changing the political climate. Politicians respond to the political weather, but our social movements ultimately change the political climate. Now, my sober assessment of the left is that we are way too disorganized to take advantage of all of the opportunities ahead of us. So we have 3 tasks ahead of ourselves. We have to organize. We have to do some coalition building so that the left could be more consolidated. However, if we stop there, then we will have lost, because oftentimes we get into the trap of just focusing on left consolidation. And left consolidation is a very different task than the work of base building, right? And movements are successful based on addition and multiplication, right? And so by necessity, we need to talk to people who aren't self-identified leftist. We need to talk to working people. Another way to demonstrate the power and impact of any left in any country is how that left is organizing working people, not how that left is consolidating itself. And I think this is something that often many of us make the misassessment. And so what we end up doing is having circular conversations with other self-identified progressives and leftists, further consolidating, further sharpening lines, right? And we're doing that at the detriment of inviting people in. And in fact, what we're building are political fraternities and sororities instead of building on-ramps that are broad enough to include people who may not self-identify in the ways that some of the folks who are like the deepest cadre of our organization self-identify. The other gap that I think feels really pressing to me on the left is like a strategic gap. And I'm writing about this, but I think that there's like different strategic tendencies. And so there is a tactical tendency, and you could identify it based on the fact that folks in the tactical left focus on particular tactics. And these tactics, they're like litmus tests. If you are involved in the tactic, that is a signal that you are in the in-group. If you aren't involved in the tactic, that is a signal that you're on the out-group and you're not part of the movement and you're not a progressive. The other thing about these tactics is underlying the tactical sort of orientation is this belief that we just need one home run. We just need one grand slam. And the entire system will fall like a house of cards. And the almost spontaneously, the working class will like gain some sort of like spontaneous consciousness, right? And so you could identify these people by how they swing wildly at home runs and wildly at grand slams, because they believe it just takes one to bring down the artifice of the entire system, right? Then there's folks who are kind of like the nostalgic left, like, just think of somebody you went to high school with who like, they're just stuck on the fact that it's like, I was one game away from, I was the captain of the football team. It's like, yeah, that was like 30 years ago, right? And so folks who are almost anchored in near wins of the left in a different context and a different time, and trying to recreate the context in the current context, right? And can't accept that the context has changed, and then I think there's people who are, like, to use like a Gramscian term, people who have made the assessment that we are in a war of position, not in a war of maneuver, which means our job is to do the inglorious day-to-day building of power, right? Because any full frontal attack on capital will mean we will be decimated. And what we have to do is discipline ourselves, build cadre, build organization, build power, build membership, build cultural power, so that we could be effective. And I'm in that camp, so I'm partial to that camp. But I think we have a crisis in the left of strategy, which leads to a lot less coalition building and a lot more sort of like incoherent sniping, right? And I think that incoherent sniping actually is like a source of energy loss, on the left. And so we have to like up our strategic game so that we can engage in meaningful debate. There's nothing wrong with like disagreeing with each other, as long as it's like generative debate, and we're incapable of generative debate. So what passes as debate is just actually people tweeting the thoughts in their head at each other, right? And of course, the thoughts in our head is not a big enough sample size, which is why we organize, right? That's why we hit doors, so that we could have a scientific, sober assessment of what actual working people, the conditions that they're under, and what they will accept and won't accept. And that needs to be the basis of our analysis, not the things we really, really feel or the things we've read about a lot. And I think us as a left maturing the maturation of our movement means getting past the phase of the things that I personally desire are where the left could go, the things that I really feel, because it is actually like, it is a neoliberal perversion of left strategy to place your personal desires ahead of a sober analysis of where working people are. And so building those mechanisms to develop that sober analysis, I think, is required for our left to mature. We're currently in like the toddler phase of analysis, where it's very much about me and what I need, right? And how much I need to demonstrate how ideologically sharp I am through the different mechanisms and tactics that I choose to align myself with, versus what is the requirement of working people, and therefore the thing that, whether or not I like it, I must do in order to advance the interests of working people.
So I would like to take that 10 minutes and insert it into the brain of every single person on the left in the United States of America. I was so inspired by the way that you broke down the various cultural and strategic things that are just getting us into a huge, huge trap of our own making. It's like such an important and profound agitation. So really appreciate it. There's a lot of questions for you. So even though I have more, I'm going to turn this over to
Sorry
the
for
class.
The long answers.
My God, that was fantastic. And I actually do mean it. I hope that gets written. You break that and like gets a huge amount of attention. It was really crucial, I think. So I think first in the queue, we've got Eliana. You're up. And maybe everyone, if you could just quickly reintroduce yourselves for Maurice, that'd be great too.
Hi, Maurice. Thank you so much for everything you said. I mean, that was like, I was like aiming to everything that you said. That was really powerful. So Eliana, I am the lead organizer for McDever, New York, and I help lead our immigration work out here on Long Island. I also live in the South Shore. And I'm so glad to hear that you're from Long Island, because I feel like you will understand my question, right? So Long Island is like very complicated, right? We are there's like a lot of packets, if not like most of Long Island, which is very conservative, and it's really hard to build that, like, progressive power. I found that to be very frustrating, and something that you said before about, like, the left trying to consolidate as opposed to, like, concentrating their energies on base building, that really, like, hit me, because I've said it like a lot of times that, like, you cannot compare New York City politics with Long Island politics, because they're just not the same. And so I have said it in some meetings, like, that we need to start building that political power to the left slow, right? Like, we really need to invest a lot of time there. But, like, there's like this urgency for some progressive groups that they just want to go all the way in without organizing. And then I feel like that affects us in a way that we're losing a lot of races. I mentioned that last week on Long Island, we pretty much, Republicans are in control of all counties. And like, how do we engage not only, like, the ones that sit at the table, right, when we're endorsing candidates and all of that, but also for them to, like, understand, like, let's say we have a candidate who's Democratic and doesn't have, like, all the left positions that we want them to have. But then we denied to endorse them. And then we have, to me, it seems like we're just giving a free pass to the Republican candidate. That's how I see it. So I don't know if you have, like, any suggestions of how we can, I mean, I suggest to make the reduction to hire like a C4 guru to help me, like, build the political work out here, because it's so complicated. So what would you think is, like, or something advice, or what you can suggest for us to start building that power from the ground up? Because if it's just a little progressive groups that are doing the work, ain't gonna work. People are not gonna hear here on Long Island.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. Long Island's near and dear to my heart. I haven't organized in Long Island for a little while, but I spent a decade hard in the paint. And I in my experience, when I did organize on Long Island, where I saw the most traction, around finding the issues that spoke to our ideology, but also spoke deeply to people's very real conditions. So we weren't just, so for example, I did a lot of work in Wyandanch and we flipped a school board, right? and the school board was completely corrupt. It was run by this pastor and his family, right? And we were able to, and like at the time, Wyandanch School District was 100% Black. I don't know if it still is. And the graduation rate was like 33%, which meant if you sent your child to that school, they were not graduating, right? That's essentially what, you know, and like your crime was choosing to live in Wyandanch, right? And so what I learned from that campaign was we spent about a year and we started off with 3 leaders who had decades of experience and connections in that community, and I'll get to why I bring them up. And they were so committed to it that they gave entree to their entire social networks. So pretty rapidly, we built from those 3 leaders to a base of 300 people. And then we segued that base of 300 people into an electoral machine. And we did the most intense sneak attack against this like entrenched Wyandanch power block. And we defeated like, I think, yeah, we defeated the 4 candidates that we, you know, and we thought we'd get to 1 or 2, but we defeated all 4. And the lesson I learned from that is that it's not just about, you know, as organizers, it's not just about the numbers of people, it's the quality of the relationships, right? And the reason we were able to like, I think I'm a pretty good organizer, but the key to the success was building the early relationships with the people in the community that were the connectors and the signifiers in the community that gave us the incredible grace and trust to begin to politicize all of these working class Black parents who then became radicalized by that experience. And I think thinking about the relationships over time, I think also we need time. The relationships over time and which are the people, like in any, because I think one of the challenges with electoral organizing often isn't thinking about how the relationships are mapped. We're thinking about getting to 50% plus 1. Like we literally don't care who you are. We don't care. We just want you to vote. All right. It's all a numbers game. And I think what we have to do is map the electoral 50% plus 1 with the mapping of the relationships. Because if we could identify, like in any community, there's probably 150 people who, if you could identify a strong column of them, you could unlock the entire community. And I think for progressives, we need to figure out what is the humble and sophisticated way we build relationships with those folks so that we could eventually be in a conversation with their networks in order to bring them to our side electorally. And I think we often miss that a step, and we spend a lot of money in broadcast electoral tactics, and we text a lot of people, we knock on a lot of doors, and we send a lot of flights of mail, but we miss that step. And I think that step, that organizing step, is going to be critical. And merging the power of the relational organizing with the scale of electoral organizing, there's something there, there's a code we have to crack there. And so that's my assessment of how we win in really tough turf. It starts with those relationships, and you can't, there's no shortcut around it. And if you don't build those relationships, the flights of mail and the door knocks with people who don't have an intimate relationship with folks could only go so far.
That was amazing. Alexandria, I think you're up next. And since you came in a little late, maybe you could also just introduce yourself for Maurice.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you so much for sharing your stories so far. I've worked, I'm also from Long Island, so repping Long Island. Grew up going to Fire Island and Rubber Roses during the summer, so Little Mermaid at heart. But anyway, I've worked for a few grassroots organizations on Long Island, the most recent of which is Pride for Youth. I ran a weekly psychosocial support group for transgender women for about 6 months last year. My current role is with a startup media company called Borderless, where I run an international internship program for youth. So a little bit about my background. Something that you had said before really got me thinking, and I was wondering if you could expand on it a bit. So let's say electoral strategies work, and we have people that we want in positions of power. You had this line of, that's the moment to do things in new ways that we haven't done before. I was wondering if you could expand on that a bit, and like what your sense of and understanding, is of innovative, sustainable, and just governance. What kind of policies do you want to see, and do you think could work? So just curious to hear a bit more about that.
Oh yeah, I could nerd out on this all day. So there's this term that folks are using that I think requires some definition of co-governance, right? And I mean, I basically believe that all politicians are in some co-governance relationship. Most of them are in a co-governance relationship with capital, right? And so, like in most city councils, no, the city council folks are not going to pass a land use ordinance if they haven't checked in with the developers. Like they're not going to do that. Doesn't happen anywhere, right? And that's just, nobody thinks about that. That just is commonplace, right? It's because they're in a seamless co-governance relationship with capital, right? And they check in. They're like, look, we're gonna do this land use thing, but if you guys aren't into it, then we're not gonna do it. All right, we'll change the ordinance in this way. We're like, we want to do this like we want to create an ordinance on affordable housing, but we're gonna give you a close read before we actually pass it. They don't do that with us. We are not in a co-governance relationship with almost any elected official anywhere. We're not. And we seek to be, right? That is our learning edge, how to get in that co-governance relationship where it's just commonplace that we don't even think about it. They're looking at the legislative agenda and they're having conversations with us, and we're creating legislation together and we're pushing it through. So I look at what we're doing at the Working Families Party with Kendra Brooks. Kendra Brooks is an independent Working Families Party at-large city council person in Philly. And the reason why that's significant is like that hasn't existed, an independent, non-Democrat or Republican at-large, that means citywide, elected official in Philly in more than 100 years. It is truly historic. But it's not just like symbolically historic. What it actually means, what it's actually looking like is Kendra Brooks, she wears a Working Families Party lapel pin to City Hall. She's not a Democrat. She doesn't identify with the Democratic Party. She caucuses with them occasionally, but she sees herself as a WFP person, and she's seeking to build a WFP caucus. So she has plans next electoral cycle to elect more at-large WFP people. I will also, just to let you know, Philadelphia and some other Northeast cities have this unique law where the minority party has to get a seat, right? So I won't get into it, but it allows for third parties like the Democratic, like the WFP to get at-large seats in Philadelphia, in DC, and certain places in Connecticut. And she's been very effective. Like, so, the Democrats and Republicans spent a lot of money to try to defeat her. And it was funny, like Democrats were spending money to save Republican seats in Philly, right? And it shows that oftentimes like corporate Democrats and sort of traditional Democrats fear the left more than they do Republicans. It's kind of like, in some ways we have a duopoly, and in duopolies, the two parties in the duopoly have a agreement, right? And that's true in our two-party system, right? So anyway, what we're doing right now with Kendra Brooks is really fascinating. She sits on our state committee. Her PAC is on our state committee. So we are in regular conversation with Kendra. She's not a target, right? We don't treat her like we're a community group and she's one of our targets and we have to hold her accountable. She is one of our cadre members who happens to be an elected official, and she does what the party would do in that position, right? And she's been really skillful at working with progressive Democrats in order to pass legislation. So she's actually passed legislation in this last legislative cycle, on housing, on some legislation around COVID, and now we're seeking to expand the working families cadre in Philly City Hall to create a progressive bloc that includes progressive Democrats and working families folks on the city council, and also elect a progressive mayor. And our plan is to be in a co-governance relationship with all of those folks. And so the Kendra Brooks example, I think why that's exciting to me is, like, if we could figure out how we do that more often in more places, even when we can't run somebody as a complete working families person, we certainly want to run, like we run a lot of people in Democratic primaries. We hack Democratic primaries and we run working families people in those primaries, is getting our folks to caucus as a WFP caucus that might be part of a broader progressive caucus. And instead of engaging in the carrot stick, top down, hold them accountable thing, like, go further. No, these are our people. And so how would you show up if you looked at these folks as your members? And that's what we're trying to model in all the places we operate. But I think Philly is the most mature example of that.
That's a really deep shift, and thank you for breaking down what co-governance could mean and giving the example. That was really, really helpful. I think next up is Nazla.
Thanks so much for being here. This has been incredibly thought-provoking. I currently do labor communications work mostly for SEIU and CWA for their national corporate accountability campaigns. But during the last New York City Council primaries, I was still at 32BJ. So my question sort of is based off of that cycle, because like you mentioned, a lot of WFP candidates did run in the primaries alongside Democratic candidates. And even for a labor union that characterizes itself as very progressive, 32BJ didn't always endorse WFP candidates. There were differences in our endorsements. There was a huge difference in who labor endorsed versus DSA versus WFP. So my question for you is, how do we do this internal work to make sure that we're uniting behind the same candidates to begin with? How do we make sort of establishment labor that's at times a little scared of losing and scared of taking a chance on some new candidates to really see the light? Because I still do SEIU work and it's no different.
Yeah, no, I mean, oh man. So yeah, I mean, look,
I can turn off the recording at this point, Maurice, if you would like. But we'll just
I mean, look, I'll answer it directly. I'll say, like, time, relationships, power. I think the nexus of those three. The more time we have, and time, somebody wisely shared with me, actually Bill Lipton, who was the director of the New York Party before Sochi Nemeka, who currently runs the New York Party. He shared with me, is like, look, we could always raise money, we can't raise time. Right? Like, and it was in the context of an election. And it was very wise, and I hold it today. Time is so precious in creating alignment, right? And it's the reason why I say that is, like, the farther out you are from a contentious or intense or a binary set of choices, the more opportunity you have to whittle down the harder edges that lead to rupture when multiple forces are trying to make that decision. When you're in the heat of a primary, it's almost impossible to consolidate, right? But when you're theoretically looking at a primary, that's when you're best set up to get your forces to consolidate. And I think that was an example of those forces not having pre-designed consolidation plans for a lot of those races and for the mayoral race. And so things happen the way they happen. So time, right? The second thing is relationships. The interrelationships are critical. And I've witnessed when people have a cadre level relationship across organizations, they could really lean into things and get their institutions to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do. But it means like the political director of Union A and the political director of Union B and the president of Union C and the organizing director and ED of organization D need to actually believe that they're part of the same movement and feel that level of cadre alignment and commitment to one another, right? And then power. It requires that there are enough forces with enough power to actually enforce the rules of alignment, right? So it requires some of those actors, one or two big unions, or 2 or 3 large organizations and a big union, or to say, look, this is what we're doing, right? Very early, like we are going to consolidate so that we could build the power that is necessary, right? If all of the power is transactional and short-sighted and like, yeah, we could do that, or we could not, then it's not going to happen. And you need the alignment of all three. You need the time, the relationships, and the powerful forces that are willing to take risks. The reality is US labor has enough power, has enough resources, has enough money that today, if it wanted to, it could just say like, look, we're just going to come together and we are going to leverage our forces to demand that the Democratic Party advances a pro-labor agenda. But they don't do it. And it's probably like witnessing it is like a constant frustration, but there's reasons why they don't do it tied to all those three things. The relationships aren't there. Nobody's making the call early and the right forces aren't making the call. And I think that explains those conditions where we're witnessing a left that could be aligned, just isn't aligned. And the one good thing about elections is that we always have opportunities to get it right again. So hopefully we can learn from this past cycle and build on that.
So I want to try to squeeze in a couple more questions before we let Maurice go. He's been incredible tonight, and he does have other important work, I think, besides teaching us to get to.
This is still happening in DC. I don't know.
I know. What is it? A few $1 trillion, $1 billion, whatever it is. Yeah. Merle, you're up.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that. And I'm going to try to keep it short, although I could say a million things. So the first thing is you talked about the opening and the sort of crisis and the crisis of legitimacy, which I agree with. And the opening, depending on who has power, whether the right will advance or whether we can do a more left possibility. But I wanted to ask you from the perspective of capital, there's been a lot of stuff out there about whether neoliberalism is going to be replaced by something else for the needs of capital. And I wonder if you had any thoughts about that, because that seems like a really interesting thing that's coming out. Yeah. On the other hand,
okay, go on.
Yeah, one other brief thing, you can either answer either one, is there seems to be sort of a coalescing around the idea that there needs to be a united front against the very broad-based or bloc against the right authoritarianism or creeping fascism. But within that, there needs to be a left independent political organization, independent line, so we don't subsume ourselves. And I wondered if that's a kind of useful framework. And if you have any ideas about that, that's kind of just a summation of it.
Sure. So I'll take the last one first. Yeah, I agree with that. And I'm reading this essay that disagrees with that is provocative, but I agree with that. I agree that we need a united front against fascism. It's real. This is not like theoretical. This is like a very animated, well-resourced, very sophisticated, far-right global project that is gaining steam, and we need a united front to shut it down. I agree that that the left will be subsumed if it doesn't have political vehicles that participate in that united front. And if you look at any united front, right, when the united front's work is complete, almost instantaneously, the united front will dissipate and the individual actors will naturally turn on themselves or turn on one another, right? And this is why, and so we should assume that if the left is part of a united front and we successfully defeat fascism, that the day after, the forces of capital that are part of that united front, the centrist Democrat, like they will immediately find a corner and stab us in it and leave us for dead, right? Like it would be immediate and quick and efficient, right? And so we should just like be clear about that and still join a united front with them, but not be Pollyanna-ish about what the arrangement is actually about, and not like pretend that we have friends there. You know, this is a relationship of necessity and convenience, right? And that's why it's really important for us to be clear about who we are in relationship to them. Another way of thinking about it is like a united front. Barbara Ransby, who's an academic who is a friend of mine, there's something that she shared with me that really got inside my head. It's like the two qualities of united front is its composition, right? And who leads it. And so we would be joining the united front, but we would not be leading it. And that's something that we have to wrestle with, right? But if we're going to join the united front, we could leverage our power to determine some of its directives and some of its prerogatives, right? Like this is like a sober analysis of the amount of power that we have. Like I would love to be like, oh yeah, and we'll lead that. Yeah, we'll lead that shit to freedom. But that is not the current conditions that we have, and that's why we need to build the power so that we can be in a leading position. Now, and that's part of why I'm so interested in building the Working Families Party. And why I'm so obsessed with our independence, that we have independent money, independent people, independent staff, independent from an independent ideology, independent from the Democratic Party and organized capital, in anticipation of a rupture, right? So that we are wholly contained. And if they try to stab us in the corner, we can at least fight back, but ultimately we could win, right? Now, the other thing that you raised about capital neoliberal. Yeah, I think that neoliberalism is absolutely losing its legitimacy all around, even with folks within organized capital, right? Like the Hewlett Foundation is spending a lot of money having a conversation about what comes after neoliberalism. And like, again, that's an opening, but we shouldn't be naive about it. Capitalism has had many phases. We're currently in the neoliberal phase. When the neoliberal era naturally ends, what's likely is for us to be in another phase of capitalism, not for neoliberalism to end and for there to magically be socialism, right? And so, yes, I think capital will decide that neoliberalism no longer is functioning efficiently for capital, and then what they will do is get ahead of it and usher in a new model that serves them, a new model of capitalism, though, right? And so if we want something different than another model of capitalism, then we need to do the lead thinking about what economic configuration, what social relations need to exist after and outside of neoliberalism, and begin to both prefigure those things and begin to find opportunities, especially in these like rupture moments and in these like crisis moments where a lot of people are like, what the hell is this stuff? Find opportunities to popularize that other model and to like operationalize that other model. That's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in governance. If not just nice Democrats or nice progressives, but actual leftists could run a state, then we could begin to practice, right, in fundamental ways and have real A/B tests. In the same way that conservatives took over Kansas and tanked the economy, right? Like, I'm really like interested in this idea of us finding small geography, small population states to begin actually running a test on left governance, because I think that's the next level for us, is to actually govern in a real way, and and have the mechanisms of state government. And I think we have some opportunities potentially to do that if we focus, which will require us to, like, I think, mount our resources in particular places versus just being really thin everywhere. Hopefully that answers some of your questions. Yeah.
Thank you. And the last question, Sarah.
Hey, I'm Sarah. I work with Surge, and I know you're familiar with a lot of our work. And my question is, like, going back a little bit more to like nuts and bolts organizing, campaign development. I mean, I share strong alignment with everything that you're sharing tonight. And then, many of us come into relationships within our organizations or with other organizations that we're going to partner on, building a campaign. And one thing I've really appreciated about this class is that, we're all, we take time to, like, what is a tool? What is a thing that we can do to push for stronger strategy so we can get to this question about what it's going to take to build power. So I'm curious, Maurice, if you have, like, as a leader in your own organization or in previous times of being an on-the-ground organizer, like, what are tools that you turn to in a place of strategy development that helps get to these questions of, like, are we actually building political power, or are we just, like, talking about something that's not actually based in reality, isn't based in base building, doesn't have real clear strategy? Yeah.
So, like, this is going to sound really antiquated, and I know a lot of people, I have tons, I'm going to say a few things, but I have tons of critiques of the Alinsky model. I think that, like, I have a racial justice critique, I have an ideological critique, but there's a lot of questions inside of the Midwest Academy, the basic Midwest Academy sort of organizing matrix. There's a lot of questions within that are, like, really good questions for any organizer that's interested in starting a campaign to ask themselves. It's like, and I think there's a number of other questions we should ask ourselves, right? But if we're not asking ourselves those questions, like, all right, like, who's my opposition? Like, who actually are my opponents? Okay, who are my people? What are my organizational considerations? Like, what stuff do we have? Like, staff, money, resources, right? Like, like that's an assessment of our power there. We're kind of, like, doing that assessment of, like, okay, what power do we actually have? Okay, like, what are our intermediary long-term and short-term goals? How do we achieve that? What are the tactics that we use? I think all those things are really helpful. I think another thing that is, like, really, I think a great tool. So there's this organization Scope, this guy, Anthony Thigpen. Hopefully, Deepak, you have him come and speak with folks. But they developed this tool that, in the early 2000s, I was trained on, that is basically all about, like, figuring out your power in relationship to other people in the field and, like, doing power mapping, right? So I think those tools are still very relevant and really helpful. Before you raise before you, like, do anything, actually do those exercises in order to ask yourself those fundamental questions. I think the other tools, like, and then I use other tools, right? Like, the thing that those things don't do, those things often are basically assessing the world as it is, right? And the thing that I've discovered with social movements is social movements are, like, almost, I don't want to say it's alchemy, it's, like, real work, but social movements actually, when they're effective, change the world as it is in real time so that you're able to do shit you weren't able to do, right? And if all you do is use those tools, you'll never tap into that part of your brain, which is why they're limited, but I think really helpful. And so, like, I have a set of tools that I use in order to, and I have a set of, like, heuristics I use in order to just kind of, like, push my mind as a strategist outside of the regular practice of doing things as I've always done them. And I learned that on the ground in Ferguson, because I remember I was on the ground in Ferguson and there's all these young people. Like, it was just a very different context than the very stale sort of professional nonprofit context, right? It's like people were shooting at us, right? Live gunfire, every single day, military with tanks chasing us, shooting at us. And we didn't have paid organizers or organizations. It was like people in street organizations, gangs, and other folks who were like the frontline folks there. And so I witnessed a lot of people who didn't have like training, organizational training, do things and commit to tactics that I'll like, yo, that's batshit crazy. What are you even talking about? And then I witnessed it working, right? And so what I learned there was that in order to be effective strategists, we need to figure out how to maintain the student's mind, how to like maintain the humility of saying like everything that's worked before may not work now. And we need to prepare for things as they are, but also imagine the 5% chance that things could change on its head, because that always could happen, right? And so there's this other tool, I'm forgetting but there's a whole other sort of methodology that I really appreciate that is like rooted in theater that I think helps us get out of, because we have to get out of our minds, right? So I'm a musician, right? And like if anybody studied seriously any instrument, like your body learns particular chord shapes, right? So like if you want to compose something, it ends up sounding like yourself, right? But if you want to compose something new, like you're like, how do I not sound like myself, right? And like musicians who are like constantly having to like push, not that they're repressed, although that's a great framework. I'll get it for you, Deepak. And so, but what we want to do is get outside of ourselves as strategists and use analytics, which are outside of ourselves and materially true as they can be. And then also use frameworks that force us to ask questions that challenge the orthodoxy of what came before. And I think, so it's like a multimodal set of tools that I think you need to use. And I think you need to break your adherence to one school of thought or one tradition. I think that's when we really limit ourselves. So I see people like everybody like is trying to find the new organizing fad, and it's like, oh, I'm a structured, like we can't do structured organizing anymore. We have to do like this whirlwind organizing. We have to do, it's like all those things have value, but it's kind of like, I also did some martial arts, and like I spent a few years doing capoeira, right? And I don't practice as much, but I used to practice a lot, and I geek out on martial arts. And one of the innovations of Bruce Lee was letting go of his form, right? Like he was trained in a particular form. And, there's different types there's classical martial arts that are from a particular time, place, and condition, right? There's competitive martial arts, and then, there are martial arts for defense. And I know I'm going all over the place, but trust me, I'll land somewhere. And the innovation that Bruce Lee started practicing like American boxing, started practicing different forms, and realized like, oh, there's certain, like American boxing has the most efficient striking. Like, I'm gonna incorporate some of that. And so I think it's important for us as practitioners to lose the need to be part of a particular organizing school, so that we could constantly adapt our organizing practice to the time, place, and conditions, and accept that what worked very well in one moment may not work again. The other sports analogy I will use, and then I'll close here, is that like, if we just had 1/10 of the discipline that elite sports practitioners had, we would be so ahead of the game. So every single game, win or lose, right? If you're serious about your sport, you are watching tape of your victory or of your loss, and you are taking notes, right? And then you are watching tape of your opponent and applying everything that you learned from your victory or your loss to the next game, right? And so that requires a level of humility and a level of like fluidity of practice that all elite athletes have. And we have to ask ourselves this question: am I in the NBA or not? If you're in the NBA, you need to apply that. What is the organizer version of watching your tape? You know, and oftentimes after a victory, we're high-fiving when we need to be watching our tape. After a loss, we have our head in the sand when we need to be watching our tape. So I would just say that, like, it's not so much about the particular tools, it's about understanding that the tools only serve a function for this particular moment, and to free yourself from needing any set of tools, and always being open to new tools and modalities and using whatever works.
So I love that this was like a master class that Maurice just delivered, I think, to us. It was so brilliant. And I love the piece that you said about mastering craft and but being able to draw from all these traditions, but then to end by saying that we need some element of beginner's mind and the ability to meet the moment freshly, as opposed to through our inherited orthodoxies. That to me is like the ultimate mastercraft, is being able to really do that. So I hope we can just come off mute for a second and give Maurice our appreciation for an amazing, really amazing session. Really appreciate you, brother. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
And thank you for what you're doing in the
Thank you.
world. Really, really inspiring work, and go get him.
All right, y'all. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you, brother. Take it
Peace.
easy. Bye. Hopefully we could spend a little time debriefing that, Stephanie, after the break, just a few minutes maybe after we come back. So let's take 10 minutes, and we'll come back at 7:50. See you in a little bit.